Good afternoon or good evening for our speaker, for example, or good morning for others. My name is Bert Hoffman. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at this seminar in the series of the Department of Epidemiology of the Harvard School of Public Health. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Siebert, who is a professor of public health, medical decision-making, and health technology assessment in the Medical Technology University of Hull in Tyrol in Austria. But also very important for us, he is adjunct professor of epidemiology and health policy management in the Harvard School of Public Health. In fact, Dr. Siebert, you are both in health policy and management and in epidemiology. You are a rare bird in that sense. There are not many who have that two adjunct positions. He is focusing on various combinations, may I say this, of decision analysis, modeling on the one hand, and epidemiologic approaches, causal inference approaches on the other hand. In fact, we'll address kind of the marriage of those approaches, and we look very much forward to hearing you, Dr. Siebert, at the interface of epidemiology and health decision science, jointly shaping cancer screening strategies. Dr. Siebert, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Hoffman. Thank you very so much. Yes, and I'm looking forward to joining these two disciplines a little bit further, as they have done already in the past. Let me share my screen. And is the interface, the connection between AP and health decision science or decision modeling. This is basically a plaidoyer to call all of us to work more together. Here are my affiliations. I'm also current president of ISPOR, where a lot of modeling and real-world evidence analysis is going on. I'm former president of the Society of Medical Decision Making, which is probably one of the biggest homes of modelers. And you also see here my email address, and feel free to drop me an email here or through the social media. There's some background if people want to know what I've done in screening, particularly in public health, because that's the topic today. And I would like to walk through these 5 points. Cancer screening strategies, what strategy means, test performance, 2 slides, and then talk about how do we evaluate cancer screening strategies with the different approaches, and use decision analytic modeling as a tool to do that. And this is all funneled towards how can we then work together between epidemiology, where we get a lot of parameters, hazard ratios, and everything. And at the other side, we want to integrate that in health decision scientific models, where we look in quality of life, costs maybe, life expectancy, and look at the trade-offs between these different outcomes. I have in my talk some what I call the start slides. They have that little asterisk on the top. Usually they're in pink. And these are for your reference. I don't go through them. So if people want to have the slides, they can have them afterwards. These are lookup slides. I want to thank everybody who basically helped me teaching the matter over the last 20 years. That were a lot of courses, but also particularly the Harvard School of Public Health in the summer sessions, and the courses, and mostly the students from which I learned how people think. So let me start with cancer screening strategies, just briefly. There are definitions what screening means in healthcare, checking for disease when there are no symptoms. But that's not enough. We're not just checking for disease and say, disease is there or not, but screening is more than detection. It is a dynamic intervention, because follow-up, the diagnostic workup will happen. And if something is positive, then there may be treatment. So we are talking in the epidemiological language about dynamic treatment regimes or dynamic interventions in this case. Not everybody is treated. So algorithms, if-then rules, that's important to keep in mind. You may know the Wilson criteria for screening. I don't read them to you, but one important part is missing and should be added. There should be an acceptable benefit harm cost balance for the screening strategy, including the entire path from screening diagnosis to treatment. If you don't like the cost here, the word cost, then ignore it, but then it's still about the benefit and harm balance. How much lives do we save and how much overdiagnosis and pain do we generate? So screening is a pathway. So we start with, screening and test procedures. Some of them may be invasive. We look at the test result and there is peace of mind. If it's negative, there is anxiety. If it's positive, there may be overdiagnosis, which means we find something that the patient would have never detected, would have never bothered him or her without looking for it. And then there is treatment, which can, give benefits, but also harms over treatment. So I show this slide because people know a lot about screening and outcomes and improving overall survival, but these harms, psychological harms, physical harms, medical harms, are underestimated and underused in the evaluation of screening. If people know how the grade system works, when we set up clinical guideline, that's an example from the S3 clinical guideline in Germany for cervical cancer screening, which is currently developed, and I'm part of this group. So in the grade system, you start with the experts to set up the benefit outcomes and harm outcomes, maybe costs, and very importantly, this is what I usually try to enforce, also the trade-offs. How do we calculate harm-benefit ratios, cost-effectiveness ratios, and so on? Many guidelines just look at the benefit-harm, and I will show you also examples from Europe and the US. Then there is the term health technology assessment, and Europe this year is the biggest health technology assessment experiment on this planet ever, because we have an overall European regulation, basically a directive, a law that forces all countries now to include specific joint evidence in their appraisals and their assessments, and then the countries still can make their own decisions. So health technology assessment is meant to guide decisions in healthcare. So we talk about choices, comparisons, trade-offs, and uncertainty. And this is one of the definitions you can read. Health technology is a comparative. So we talk about differences. In epidemiology, we call this the effect measures. We cover a broad range of domains, which you will see on the next slide. We address the uncertainty explicitly, and in the end, we would guide decisions. We're not promising that we tell the truth, but we go for the best bet, the best expected values with the given knowledge at that time. So this is a slide coming on the left side from UNETA, the European Network of Health Technology Assessment. On the right side, you see exactly the same terms from the current website of the European legislation. And on the left side, you see what people in the HTA language call domains. You can also call that different types of outcomes. So we focus first and foremost on safety and effectiveness and the trade-off between benefits and harms. But then there are also other sort of buckets here: economic, ethical, organizational, patient and social, and legal aspects that we will look when we implement a new technology. So, and there is also the guidance of WHO, say we would like to increase effectiveness, maximize benefits, and minimize harm. Now, this is very important. You cannot at the same time maximize the benefits and at the same time get the minimal harm. That's exactly the trade-off. The more invasive you are, the more benefits you may get, but also the more harm. So you have to find the balance, which nobody may want to admit, but this is one of the goals that we are doing. So this guide also misses the trade-off question. There is not such a thing as a free lunch. This is one of my star slides. So these are some background information about the HTA-R, the European HTA regulation. When we talk about screening test performance, most of us know how to do that with accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, ROC curves, likelihood ratios, predictive values. But I want to emphasize one thing which is underused and maybe also in teaching, not emphasized enough. And we spent actually hours in our summer school course in Harvard talking about this. There are three independent ingredients for decision making, especially when tests are involved or additional information like in screening, diagnostic testing. One is the prior probability of getting something. So that would be the prevalence, clinical scores, risk scores to calculate how is the prior probability in the the Bayes theorem. Then we have the test information. A test may be having a good ROC curve, a high sensitivity and specificity, and that's the independent piece. So if you have a good test, that's good for decision making. But none of those carry the consequences explicitly. So we use decision analytic modeling because after each of these test results, there may be a decision to treat or not to treat, which leads to overall survival, quality adjusted life years, costs, and other things. So if what is very important, if you have found a cutoff on the ROC curve where you call a test positive versus negative, if the pretest probability or the consequences change, you should have a different cutoff on the same test, and that's not always happening and used. In other words, without going too deep into that, the ROC curve is an efficiency frontier showing the benefits on the y-axis and the harms on the x-axis, 1 minus specificity. And there is a trade-off between these two things, and you want to optimize the slope of the ROC curve. I show you another efficiency frontier, more clinically oriented. So consequences do matter. And this is what I wanted to show, the ROC curve. Here you have different cutoffs that you can use. Some of them are lenient on the right hand and left is strict. It is not true, like I was taught, the best cutoff is here, where the curve is at the upper left corner, maybe a tangent of 1. This is just to call it, frankly, not sufficient to think of. That would be the wrong answer, the closest to the upper left corner, because that would assume that we have a prevalence of 50% and the false positive and false negatives consequences are the same, and then just the test decides. So that cutoff depends on the prevalence, and it also depends on the consequences. And when we are in screening, we are probably more on the lenient side because we say we have a confirmatory test, and we just want to, get the fish, do the screening, and find the people. Now, if the workup is more invasive or more dangerous or more costly, we may not go as far as lenient as we are here. So that's one of the ROC curves of a multi-cancer detection score, just some references for you. Now, how do we evaluate these cancer screening strategies? And that slide takes a little bit longer. So we have what I call the evidence domain 1, which is the test accuracy. Well, very first, you actually have the prevalence, right? You can call that a separate domain, prior probability. But then you apply the test. And what you see here is what we call a little probability now. So, some people do not have the disease, but here are the deceased with the prevalence. And within the deceased, we have a test positive with a probability of sensitivity, 1 minus sensitivity, and so on. So we get these 4 different, the cohort falls into 4 different parts, false and true positives and false and true negatives. So that could be done in a cross-sectional study, maybe with a gold standard to get until here. So that's why I put here, the time of such a study is days, weeks, or you can even do it in 1 day. So this is the test together with the prevalence. The prevalence may be even known. Then the next domain is what happens in the next, days, weeks, maybe months. This is about further diagnosis workup, maybe repeat testing, maybe send the patient home in screening. You would say, wait for another 3 years, come back. And then in other cases, we would start the therapy when we think it's a true positive. If it's a false negative, then we will follow the natural history, and then we may have to wait in screening until the patient develops symptoms. So this is progression, treatment effectiveness, harms, and overtreatment. But then comes the long time, the next decades. So we'll decide whether the patient survives after treatment or dies anyway, get a relapse, and so on. So mortality, morbidity, and quality of life come in here over many years. And that includes also anxiety. Will I get another cancer, even if the person is cured? So that's what we usually don't get from empirical studies. not from clinical trials, and often also not even from real-world evidence, registry data, and so on, because it just takes long. So we have to glue together parameters from these different domains, and we take them from different studies, cross-sectional accuracy studies, follow-up treatment studies, and on the right side, from long-term, even background mortality from statistical bureaus in the countries. And then we glue them together, and that's what we call linked evidence and screening models. And I will show you what we mean with models in this case. So all this together are the components that go into a decision analytic model, as we call it. So the first part is usually a decision tree model, and very often we use so-called state transition models for the remaining part. Just to emphasize again, when we talk about harms, it's not just the physical harms. It includes overdiagnosis, anxiety, and of course also costs. If you want to put that as harm, usually we use a different word. We call it cost. You may know these kind of fact boxes, which are an attempt also to show that there are trade-offs between benefits and harms. Now, what the fact boxes very often do is they may give you, the four numbers, the health outcomes in the intervened group and the non-intervened group, but also the harms in both. But in the end, these are four numbers that you have to bring together to look at a trade-off. I did that with one example. We have trade-offs. So we have incremental harms, additional harms with screening, and additional benefits. So people may know that from the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, but we also have an incremental harm benefit ratio, much less used. So the delta of additional diagnosis itself is not a nice feeling. It may be necessary, but that's that can generate anxiety, and the delta in survival. So in this case example here from this fact sheet, we got 17 extra diagnoses in order to basically gain 5 people surviving. That's a good harm benefit ratio. A lot of life for not too many more diagnoses. So the question is here now, the number is 3.4. Are we willing to accept 3 to 4 over diagnoses to save one life? And most people would say, yes, that's what we are willing to do. But sometimes then would we accept 100? Would we accept 1,000? Would we accept infinite? And then the answer becomes no at some point in time. I'm not even talking about cost, but what the damage you do when you follow, you should not harm. Now, what are the study designs for screening? We can do randomized controlled trials with a limited time horizon. We can't do the full, usually the full, by the end of such a trial, we would have probably, artificial organs, and we don't need the results anymore. They have the problem of duration, but they have also, even in trials, you may have, let's call it deviations or biases, contamination. People may not comply to their arm. So the intention to treat analysis doesn't give you the per protocol, the valid per protocol. The question is whether we have equipoise. An example I will show you in a minute where you definitely cannot do an RCT is when you say, I'm not testing screening versus no screening. I'm testing whether we should continue to do breast cancer screening starting in the age of 50, or should we start in the age of 45? That's a very small change, an increment, and it would take many countries and many decades to find out empirically whether that changes overall survival. So here we need modeling, and epidemiology can help with long-term registry data, but in the end, we must feed a lot of these things into a model. So the next, what I just mentioned already, is observational real-world studies. They have their own issues. Do we have, all the confounders and variables we need to control for biases, data quality? I'm not just talking about confounding, but I'm also picking up the last term on my slide, self-inflicted biases, which we have now in the last year got good tools, target trial emulation, and avoiding immortal time bias and these things, cloning, censoring, weighting approaches to solve these problems. So there are strengths and tools to overcome these. And even our journalists have now acknowledged that we can answer causal questions within the limitations, and we should be honestly talking about that. I'm referring to Miguel Hernan's paper about the Siebert. So this is now on the table. And then we have decision-analytic modeling, where we try to get these causal estimates and plug them in, not blindly, but very carefully. And this is what I call the linked evidence. It gives us the advantage of integrating things, but we still have to do many assumptions because some of these parameters come from different studies, not from the same study base. And the question is, does that work, or is there too much effect modification in these things? So the tool is decision analysis or decision analytic modeling or linked evidence. And the goal is to optimize, to find the optimal strategy after balancing the outcomes. And we very often have much more than just one or two comparators here, so we can have more. It all goes down to diagnostic testing in part, but screening is even more complicated because it's repeat testing. So if you would like to know more about that, there was a white paper with the Agency of Healthcare Quality, Research and Quality, where I was participating together with Tom Tricalinos and Joe Lau. Now, this is an important slide, and I'd be interested in how many people have seen such an efficiency frontier and given some thought on it. So you may take that slide and digest it a little bit further in your own time. But what you see here is on the y-axis, you see the life years gained per 1,000 people. And on the x-axis, you see the colonoscopies per 1,000 people. The first author was Amy Knudsen from our school here. She was actually one of my peers when we studied. And she's a decision scientist, and she developed, together with the team, she developed a model working together with, trialists and registry people. And what you see here, without going into details, are many, many different strategies. Each dot here on this plane is a strategy. Because if you have different starting ages, different end ages, different screening intervals, and different combinations of tests, that gives you, 5 times 2 times 4, and so on, a lot of strategies. You could never do a trial. You could probably do observational study with target trial emulation to emulate a trial with 15 arms or with 20 or 30 arms. That's possible, and particularly also our school has done a lot of work, and together with many other peoples around the world. So the thing I would like to point out here is that when you generate that, you get these benefit harm points here. Now, you could say a colonoscopy is not a harm. That is true. What they actually wanted to do here, I talked to Amy Knudsen here, they wanted to put it on the y-axis, the benefits, and on the x-axis, the costs, to do a cost effectiveness study. But that doesn't fly very well in the United States. So you basically do a proxy for costs, and you call it burden, because a colonoscopy is a burden. And it carries the invasive, maybe rare side effects of perforations and other things, but also, incidental findings, overdiagnosis, probably not so much in colorectal cancer screening because we can remove the adenoma. So it's a hidden cost effectiveness analysis, and they called it burden. It's a benefit burden analysis. That was a very smart move, I have to say. So what you can see from that is that there are a lot of the strategies that don't make sense because they lie below this efficiency frontier. That means they have less benefit and more harm than the others. So we can eliminate them. That's one of the richest things we can do from decision models. Then we still have the others left. So you could basically say, we go here where the slope is steep, that's a favorable benefit harm ratio, or we go there. So you really have to read off the slope here and see, are we willing to accept X harms in order to gain one benefit? And I'm going to show one example from Austria where we had to do that. It's not an easy task. So with increasing intensity of screening, the benefit harm balance and cost effectiveness declines. So this is an example that I mentioned. So we were recently tasked by IQWiC the German HTA body, to do a model for breast cancer screening because they wanted to extend the age limits from starting with 50 to 45. And then they looked actually into the data and they found some, good epidemiological studies, some RCTs, but they were all not sufficient and very old. And this is one of the moments where I was really very, very touched, tears in my eyes, because we were praying over decades to HTA bodies like ICRIC and others. For screening, you must use modeling because the trials don't give you the answer. And then we had hearings, and then they put the modeling results in the appendix, or model result that UMIT Tyrol has performed with myself and my team. And then they still were discussing about the old trial data. And all of a sudden, one person, leadership person of ICWIC, said, look, I think all these comments in the hearings, which said you should look more to the model results, I think they are right. Why do we look at the old data and not at the modeling results? So this was one of the moments where your work, not just is a little wheel in the big machine, but it changed the life of millions of German women, hopefully to the good. So what you can see here is we put down, because we are very careful about benefits and harms, which are included in the quality adjusted life years, we looked at the overall survival. And the winner was, no wonder, screening, very early age, even annually rather than biannually in the beginning. And that gave us the highest life years gained here about all these non-dominated strategies. But, and that's also not a surprise, if you look at the quality adjusted life years here, they decline when you get more invasive. And that's usually a slight U, the opposite of a U curve. And the winners are here somewhere in the middle, are more modest, still starting with the age of 45, but keeping them at 2 years rather than going to 1 year. And that changed, basically, that changes now the life of the German women in the healthcare system. So this is one of the examples how you can look at benefit harms in the efficiency frontier that I have shown from the US Preventive Services Task Force first, or here incorporating QALYs, which is not always an easy task. Best is to look at both. ICWIC went on, not with this study, but with another one where we did the modeling for them for cervical cancer screening, and also that is often not known. How do we communicate this to the patient, to the citizen, to the screenee? Because we cannot, as guideline developers, say what is an acceptable benefit harm ratio for a person. Some people may say, I'm fine to, have overdiagnosis, maybe lose some organs if I can live longer. And others would say, no, I need my body. And if it takes, I will not take all the harms. So what we have to do is, in addition to deciding about what would be good recommendations, possibilities, reimbursed screening strategies, we have to know what is the benefit, what's the harm for an individual. And these are patient and citizen brochures where you have, in this case, 16 pages, and 8 are about the benefits, 8 pages are about the harms, and they're always reflected from left to right so that you have the benefits and the harms side by side. So ending about modeling here and coming to my plaidoyers. So what you see here is what we can do with models. We can adapt and use them across regions and times. This was the example of cervical cancer screening. The model traveled really through time and space to different occasions. So I only have time to show you one model, and I announced that in the abstract, colorectal cancer screening, because we have both here, a lot of modeling studies, but also including our own school here, target trial emulations. So a decision analytic model, just to give you some theory and some slides to digest, incorporates all these little pieces in one model. That I was asked to write an article about when should we model, when doesn't it make sense. So this is outlined here. Basically, when you have too many choices or you have to integrate too much parameters at the same time. There are different kinds of models, which I will not go through. This is what we do in our modeling courses, simple decision trees and state transition models here, and then others that we use for infectious diseases or waiting lines. So mainly we have two types of models, state transition models. We have cohort models where we run the entire cohort piece by piece, and we call them state transition Markov models. But we have also what we call microsimulation, maybe more known by us epidemiologists, when you run individual patients through that. That doesn't mean you need to have an individual data set, but you just run individual patients with many different characteristics. Usually they carry their own regression scores with many, many different variables. So they have so many different profiles that you cannot put them in, simple buckets and states. There is more about model types on my star slides here. There are modeling guidelines which we developed together, the ISPOR and SMDM, the two societies. There is a particular one also on state transition modeling, which I participated, so that gives you more details. Now, how have these models been used? There was a nice review in the past, and I'm only focusing on this one bar, and it shows that 40% used cohort state transition models, and 34, a little bit less, used a microsimulation, and then some other model types. That doesn't mean that one or the other is better, but that gives you an overview. And whether to use one or the other is also described in our modeling guidelines when you should use a microsimulation and why not. I give you some examples of microsimulations here for colorectal cancer screening. This was the model used for the analysis I have shown you before, Amy Knudsen for the US Preventive Services Task Force. There is another nice paper that is basically a risk factor intervention model. So what happens if I change one of my behaviors? We know some epidemiologists would say these are not really causes. My body mass index is not an intervention. Nevertheless, these things have been examined. And this is the paper that we published or we used, and there's an update was just published recently for the Austrian guidelines. So what we do here is we fill out this table of what's the perspective, the time horizon here, lifetime, the health states, the outcomes, the study type. Here it was a benefit, harm, and cost effectiveness analysis, Markov state transition model. And we look at, full and partial adherence. So this is how such a model looks like. This is a more complex model because what happens here is you start screening healthy, probably healthy people, and then you may, find adenoma. If you don't screen, they may develop adenoma here, and maybe advanced adenoma if they're not screened, and move on to cancer. And the screening would try to basically detect people here not just by symptoms, which is now in my red box, but to catch them earlier. So find the adenoma and then, remove the adenoma and make the patient healthy again. You may also find some advanced adenoma. That means you come in a different workup loop. You will have now maybe only every 3 years. You will have the colonoscopy every 3 years rather than after 10 years again. And we try to detect people by screening. So the idea of this, and this is important here, the connection between causal inference and decision science really becomes very, very interesting, and not everything is solved yet, is that we basically have to challenge these state shift models, because we basically say if we detect somebody, with a stage 2, rather than diagnostically with symptoms in stage 2 with screening in stage 1, we borrow the survival curve from the stage 1 people, but they may be different. They may have different, speeds and different cancers. So one example that we got from Hermann Brenner, one of my future mentors actually, who has had recently a talk here as well. He published regression models that adjusted for whether the mortality benefit, how that was coming from screen detected and symptom detected cancers, and basically the symptom detected cancers were much faster. And this is what we have to adjust in our model. We cannot just take the state shift, but we have to say, well, there is a factor, and in this case it was 0.36, which says that tumors or adenoma that we find by screening are much more benign, and their prognosis is better than the symptom detected. We know that, but here we have the numbers to do that. So I'm kind of ending this session. So this is what we did for Austria. This is our efficiency frontier. You see, we have a little bit less strategies here, but on the x-axis we had positive test results. So that's one of the carriers for maybe overdiagnosis and other things. On purpose, we took positive, not just false positive, and on the top we have life use gain. And you see that here we actually put down the numbers, so you can see in order to go here you accept 5 positive test results for life use gain, but here you have to accept 30 and so on. So this is the trade-off that is difficult to check. I'm going to skip validation. So we have possibilities to do validation, and this is a field where decision scientists must work together with epidemiologists. We must compare our results with registry data, individual data analysis. And this is basically one of the things I would like to ask. So let me close with some call for joint work and action. There is an interface between EPI and health decision science. We act, basically a decision model is like a set of connected equations. And we need data. We need empirical data coming from epidemiologists, descriptive data, prevalence, but also the effect measures, the intervention measures coming from causal inference. The decision models then can also backwards inform clinical trials and observational research. What are the promising on my whole cloud of strategies? What are the 5 promising that I should send into a clinical trial? And epidemiological analysis, again, can serve as validation, as I have mentioned. So here one request to epidemiologists. First, think about contacting health decision scientists and working together. Optimize your risk prediction cutoffs in a consequence-oriented manner. Don't freeze cutoffs of RSC curves. Jointly, let's create DAGs, and sometimes in decision science we call them influence diagrams. Do that together. Develop the analysis plan and a target trial emulation before we analyze the data that are used in models. Report the data in a way that decision-making models can use them. Maybe not like the 5-year probability, but the annual incidence density ratio or something like that, because usually we go annually in these models. Report and also look at the trade-offs, measure the harms and try to derive them. In the end, keep in mind that all the results that you may publish, they may speak for themselves, but they're also used by others. So this also has a lot to do with reporting. Sometimes we look in the publication. We know they had the data, they had the result, but there was no space. They didn't publish it. So we were lucky with the Brenner study that I just showed you. And something was published there, but who publishes like 10 different regressions with different models? So reporting guidance for epidemiologists basically means give us the pieces, the rate of progression given the treatment, and the next piece would be death given progression, and so on. Give the outcomes over time, give us curves rather than just probabilities. How does things develop over time? I mentioned the incidence densities. Give us ratios and differences, because we may need one or the other rather than just odds ratios from logistic regressions. Time-dependent and state-specific estimate, conditional numbers, total disease-specific, both mortality rates, we use them in our model separately. A lot of adjusted, different adjustment for regression analysis and hazard ratios and Cox models. Give us the causal context. You do that, but we can be better in understanding those with DAGs, estimates, target trial emulation, and that's something we can do together. We don't have to tell people here, be careful with p-value based variable selection, but very often we see machine learning based variables in a regression model. They are not causal. We can't use them in our causal decision model. So think about what is causal. Is a cancer stage, being in cancer stage 1 rather than 2, is that causal, or because that's what state shift is doing. But we have also reporting guidances for modelers. We have to apply causal model structures. We have to describe our model input parameters so that the epidemiologist can check them and say, yeah, I believe that. I'm the reviewer of this paper. That makes sense. And clearly explain, we should, as decision scientists, clearly explain the model structure, show them to epidemiologists so they can check all that things that see here, including the DAGs, what to condition on, and what are the uncertainties and the multivariate regression functions. So these are the things we can do together. The ultimate decision question, what's the target experiment? I don't call it target trial, but the experiment, should I go in universe 1 or 2? What should be my screening? What are the relevant benefits, harms, cost, equity issues, trade-offs? Let's talk about trade-offs in every epidemiological analysis. These are 2 outcomes. Which estimates are needed? Jointly develop the DAG and jointly discuss what should we publish, how should it be published, and look at further research. So if we do that, we may move from duplicate the comparison between RCTs and real-world evidence. If we add model results here, I think we're in a good space. And if you want to know more, I have some readings here. We have the Society of Medical Decision Making and ISPOR doing these things. Of course, the epidemiologic societies. We have also a course on modeling in our university here. It's an online course. And with that, I thank you very much.
Dr. Siebert, I thank you very much for this really extensive overview, with, by the way, a lot of guidance and guidelines for both epidemiologists and modelers. You went very fast in that, and I'm not sure I immediately got everything, but I thank you in any case very, very much for bringing it up. If you unshare, Uwe, then I ask people whether they have, except for applause, which I agree with, also perhaps questions or comments. Whom can I give the floor? You can do it in the chat, then I can also read it for you, but I prefer when you come out. And if you ask a question, it is being recorded. This is what Beth Williams, who organizes this very, very well, these seminars, just put in the chat. Any questions or particular comments from your side? Let me try to start off. Or I was, it's perhaps in some senses in the whole spiel that you gave somewhat of a detail, but I liked these 2 type of models, big picture models that you had. What it is a Markov state transition on the one hand, and the microsimulation models on the other hand. Can you elaborate a little bit on the differences between the 2, and when do you use what, or do you use it in combination? Can you elaborate a bit on that, Uwe?
Thank you. Yes, and that's also part of, actually, that was one of the guideline papers. I was the first author, and Tian from my team and Karen Kunz and many others helped us with that, which tells when to do this or that. A good rule is start simple and get complicated if necessary, unless you have a company that wants to sell you a very expensive model development. And that would mean that we start usually with states. So if we can, and that's the verbatim formulation in the paper, if you can express the disease with a few health states and transitions, like very often in cancer, that's the case, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, then you can use usually very often Markov models, and you have a deterministic way of, you have one run, you let the cohort run through and it falls in different pieces and everybody is dead. When you have, the typical example would be less used in screening, and this is a little bit what you could compare with the Chi formula in causal inference. When you have many different characteristics and patients have a blood pressure and cholesterol and age and so on, and have different results, then they may be in 5,000 different states just because of the combination of these variables. And then you would have so many states, and we call that state explosion. And you want to consider that. That's what we currently do with the diabetes models. All these variables are very important, and a patient is characterized by at least 10 or 20 characteristics, giving us thousands of states. Then you could technically still do a Markov model with 5,000 states, but you cannot use, you have to write code lines with loops. So that is when we go to microsimulation. The advantage is that you don't write the memory on the bucket of the state, but the patient in your model carries a patient record with him or her, and the memory is reserved. So that's why it's not Markov, it's not memoryless. The disadvantage is that you have to run 1 million patients through your model to get a stable average, because based on some random number generator and the risks of these patients, they die or not. That would not be a problem running 1 million patients, but there are additional levels for sensitivity analysis and probabilistic sensitivity analysis that need another loop to run another maybe 100,000 loops, and then it gets 100,000 times 1 million. And for what we call value of information analysis, there is actually a third loop, and then you have to start doing some tricks, because still today computers cannot solve that. So it's about the trade-off in the future. With quantum computing, you won't ask that question anymore. Maybe everything would be a microsimulation.
Thank you. This was a good explanation for me as a naive listener. Luis Azevedo, please go ahead, Luis.
Thank you so much. And I would like to start by thanking Professor Uwe Siebert for the excellent presentation. It was really very, very interesting, and it shows a work of many, many years that is, I would say, finally having the attention that it deserves. And certainly in the future, we hope that many, many other problems could, with decision analytic model and health decision sciences, be solved, or at least have better solution for those problems than we have today. My question, I am quite keen with decision analytic modeling, of course, but one question that we many times have is, when we have a decision analytic model, be it it could be a decision tree or a Markov model, we have to estimate many different parameters. And my question is, many times we have, it is not clear what's the evidence that we should be using to indicate or use or establish the better estimates for each one of these parameters. So my question, and actually it's two questions, is what's the role of evidence synthesis when estimating those parameters? Is it useful, and how useful it is, the current methods and approaches that we have in evidence synthesis, in order to get better estimates for each one of the parameters that we need? And we have models with a lot of different parameters. And my second question would be, whenever we are considering to use the methods and approaches of evidence synthesis, the current methods, we often get into troubles with transferability. So my second question is, how do we solve the problem of transferability of estimates when trying exactly to estimate the parameters that we need in those models? And this introduces also a problem of eventually having different versions of the same model. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, this is an excellent. This is a question that comes from practice, so it clearly shows that people who work with that stuff will ask that question. I pull it together to one question, and I give a very short answer, also to give maybe somebody else time to ask a question. And I think that's the essence. We do, when we have multiples for one parameter, then we want to do meta-analysis, and that's what you call evidence synthesis. But keep in mind, meta-analysis only increases the power. narrows the confidence interval, which is very important because we have a lot of parameters and a lot of uncertainties. At the same time, sometimes we pull together things that not coming from the same age groups or so. So when you use meta-regression, for example, then you can have a covariate of age, maybe location, and then you can use it, question number 2 you had, to basically get a formula that gives you the parameters that is standard way for your population would like to do. So that's what we look at. We don't just blindly pool, but we also look at these meta regression and effect modifiers and go for it. But it is a lot of work. If you have 50 parameters, it's 50, systematic reviews. That's the biggest time-consuming work in a decision analysis, and maybe AI may help us in the future with that. Not yet, but soon maybe.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Marcel Zwalen. Bern, please, Marcel, would I see it in the, but there he is. Yes. Please, Marcel, ask your question.
Hi, Bert. Hi, Uwe. Sorry. I wrote it down, but I can rephrase. And so I really like the issue about harm benefit balance discussion or then quantification. I wondered a bit how then your machinery integrates sort of people, person, patient, whatever the P is meaning, preferences, and where do you get them from to integrate these into these harm benefit discussions?
So excellent, Mars. It's nice to see you here. Good. I see a lot of friends and colleagues here. So my answer is here on the slide.
Okay, that was quickly done. I didn't notice.
Benefits and harms of prostate cancer. Looking at the outcome of individual patients. And what we see is what we did is we said overdiagnosis, sexual dysfunctions, and incontinency and other problems you can get from radical prostatectomy have different severities for different people. Some say, okay, sex is not important for me anymore. Others say, well, I just, I want to live that life that I had, and I don't care so much about when I die. So we applied that and put different multipliers to different preferences of males. And then what we saw is that depending on these preferences, you see here the sensitivity analysis at the bottom for the preferences, that you see that different treatments or screening strategies, starting early, doing it once in a lifetime, only having narrow intervals, they change. So what you can see is probably what's the worst is doing a one-time screening at 69. But when you go higher, then you see if the multiplicative factor of this utility is here, people would go for an interval screening every year. But if the factor is more severe and that the disutility is more important for this man, then all of a sudden the winner here is no screening at all. And that's and now translate that into a conversation with a man. That is more difficult, but this is the first step. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to show this part here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, we have a hard stop because teaching goes on in our institution. But I would like to say 3 things actually. Number 1, I liked very much your triangle at the end. Randomized trials, real world evidence, and models. That's what you work on. So it's a very type of conceptual approach. That's not one. Second, I would like to say that I thank you very much for this very, very insightful in many senses and overview of your modeling approach and the possible link with epidemiology. And I think we will learn from you more in the future and have more integration. And finally, I will thank everybody who is here in the audience, and I invite you again to a seminar, same time, same place, on Zoom, namely next week. And there we will have a so-called postdoc update. And this will be our postdoc Ying Li, who works with Miguel Hernan, and Miguel will also be there in that seminar. And Ying Li will talk about the nice G formula. If you want to know what that is, you have to come next week, same time, same place, to this seminar. I thank you all very much for being here, and I thank in particular, of course, Dr. Uwe Siebert for his great presentation. Many thanks.
Thank you all. Thank you.